So OOPSI's been around for about 8-9 years, and the first time I was talking about it was at Matthew Skelton's continuous delivery meetup, going back like 10 years, and that's kind of before it had a name. And I'd spent about 20 plus years in tech and tech leadership at that point, with a lot of focus on practices that bring different disciplines in a team together to properly collaborate well. So that was the thing that really motivated me. And then over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, I've been doing lots of kind of consulting, but I've been drawn back to my roots in psychology and doing lots of team flourishing, high-performing teams type stuff. But OOPSI keeps coming back at me. So I did a lot of training about 8 or 9 years ago, did the whole conference scene, and it keeps coming back at me. And so I thought, I need to get this out there. So I've been contacted by had reach outs from some big companies that I'll tell you about them down the pub. I can't mention them. And I've been like, what? How? Wait a minute. And so it's obviously clicked with folks, which is brilliant. So now I'm back in this space and writing a book. The book's pretty much written. I'm looking for people interested to give it a try, feedback, maybe a case study for version 2. Who knows? So yeah, I'd love to chat to you about it down the pub. So what is it anyway? It's a framework, it's a conversation tool, it's a collaboration technique, it's an analysis technique, it's a story splitting tool, it's a whole load of things. It has a lot of different applications. But it basically helps teams break work down. It helps you get started really, really quickly so that you can balance pace and rigor. So get to a really good slice of work without compromising understanding or shared understanding, but do it really fast. And so yeah, it helps strongly align teams, and from the feedback I've had from folks who've been using it for the last few years, they've had some remarkable results about how it's sped up delivery. So I'm not a deeply technical person. I've worked in tech for a long time. This is about collaboration and ways of working. So I hope it resonates with you. So what is it? In the large, I kind of talk about OOPSI in the large and in the small, because you can use it from different starting points. Like anything that you examine, you can start from a really big thing and use this approach. And if you do that, it's a bit like this, which I'll talk about in a minute. Or you can use it in the small on something as small as a story or an epic or a feature to help you get to something really concrete quickly. And in the large, it's like this. Does anyone recognise this? I mean, it's my terrible drawing. Do you recognise it? Anyone old as me? And it's like, this isn't my analogy, actually. It's been around for ages. Jeff Patton, in his book, User Story Mapping, mentioned it. And it's not even his. It's from a guy called MJ. I tracked him down so I can reference it in my book, who's been around in the Agile space for years and years and years. And so what I mean by asteroids, the 80s game, right? So if you take yourself back, I'm taking myself back to 1981 on my BBC Basic. It wasn't called asteroids, it's called meteors. And it starts with these big, slow-moving meteors, and that jug, jug, jug moving around the screen. And you're this little dude, and you're thrust, shift, back, up and down. I've got the muscle memory already. And you're spinning around and you're trying to blow these asteroids up. The thing is that when you blow them up, the next set of asteroids start moving a bit faster, the smaller ones. And then if you blow those up, the next ones are moving even faster. And so if you just indiscriminately go blow up the asteroids, like boo, 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 all around in all directions, you just get squished, because you have so many tiny asteroids floating around. Okay? And the analogy there is upfront analysis, right, where you're breaking everything down, and then you might feel completely overwhelmed with the amount of complexity and detail that's there. So the way to get on in asteroids is to be much more selective, right? You take a big asteroid, and then you go clear up. You leave the other big asteroids alone, until you've done some clear up. And that way you stay alive. So the analogy here is, we don't want to break everything down at once. We want to be really deliberate in doing that breaking down. And in OOPSI, you're navigating very deliberately towards something valuable. And so it's almost like a bit of design thinking. You're looking at the asteroids going, which is the most valuable one? I'm going to go and inspect this one. And then when you look in there, you're saying, which is the most valuable piece? And then you inspect again. Okay, so you're trying to leave as many big asteroids alone as you can. So that's kind of OOPSI in the large, which hopefully you'll get to understand as I go through the talk. OOPSI in the small is much more like story splitting. So I don't know if you've heard of this, or what we're looking for is a vertical slice, right, of functionality, so that we can test how everything actually works together. But also we get some quicker feedback in terms of whether things actually work. We get quicker feedback from the real world. And so we're not interested in, I was going to say we're not interested in a piece of cheese on its own, but I think I could be convinced. But certainly not the lettuce, right? What we really want is the whole experience. And so this is sometimes called elephant carpaccio. Who did that? I have a think, I'll come back to you later. This is, the hamburger model is Gojko Adzik, who is very involved in the BDD community. So this is in the small. It helps you inspect something and very quickly get to a lean worked example. Okay, so this is OOPSI kind of in a nutshell. So what is it? It's essentially these 5 steps, which I showed you at the beginning: outcomes, outputs, process, scenarios, inputs. And so this is a way of thinking, it's a way of having a conversation, it's a way of unpacking something, but you start from the outside and you work your way in. It's informed by BDD type approaches, behavioural driven approaches, but also something, I don't know if any of you know Chris Matz or have heard of him. He was quite active in this space about 8 years ago, something called feature injection, starting with the outside behaviour and the outcomes and working your way in. And so if we try and understand what OOPSI is trying to achieve with these different steps and kind of talk through them. So all OOPSI is saying when it comes to outcomes is not this, right? So I don't know if you've heard of the term, of course, my font is not compatible. Yeah, I should have thought that. Template zombie, you might have heard of this. Have anyone heard of this term? So this is where we just become almost too governed by the tools and the rules and the templates. And, user stories come from a really good place. And, the idea of having somebody who needs a need and understanding what the need is and what the change is going to make is really important. But I've worked with so many teams who are working in silos, just churning this stuff out to meet a particular parlance. And I've seen things like this, really not far off it, which just kind of blows my mind. So OOPSI says, really think about outcomes, explore them, understand the problem, have conversations, use whatever rich storytelling techniques that you have available to you to properly understand and align to what you want to achieve, the change you're trying to make. And of course in the book there's a lot of detail about different ways of doing that. Mostly though we'll start from here because we assume that the outcome is clear. So outputs. What are outputs? They're the then. If you're familiar with given, when, then, the outputs are the then, right? They're the expected result. They're the thing that's tangible, the thing that happens. It's not a process step. It's not a feature. It's a thing, right, that comes out of a system. It doesn't have to be physical. It doesn't have to be visible to a user, but it's some kind of thing that is a result of something happening. And systems thinking says that, so systems thinking has been around for years and years and years, looking at nature, science, all sorts of different systems. And this is one of the rules of systems thinking, which is the value of a system lies in its outputs. So if we're looking at our complex systems, if we look for the outputs, we're starting to get to the really important stuff. So for example, if you were involved in a big ERP implementation, a really important output would be a payslip. Yeah? And another really important output would be somebody being paid the right amount. And so if you think you've looked for the boulders analogy, the asteroids, you've looked for the big important outcomes, you've chosen one that you're looking at, and then you're going to expect and see what are the outputs that help define success. And that's a really good opportunity to prioritize. So in an ERP system, how many different outputs? Hundreds, thousands. But if you take an example, OOPSI is all about examples. Find an example of a useful example of a payslip. Not just any payslip, this payslip. This payslip from this UK non-student loan, not taking their pension, define it. So this gives you an opportunity to just radically focus in towards something very specific, which means that you can be very linear in the way that you get there. Because if you're generating this specific payslip for Jenny Martin, then you know the exact path that's going to happen for you to get there. So it's a brilliant way of getting started with something, aligning to an output. It can be a bit confusing because people say, don't talk about outputs, talk about outcomes. OOPSI says, yes, talk about outcomes first and then look for outputs. The next step is process. Another rule of system thinking is about the importance of the process. The system is characterized by the interactions of its components and the non-linearity of those events. And process, understanding the steps that are required to generate a particular output, is a really, really useful thing for a team to align around. And so I'm going back like decades and decades back into UML and use case modeling and things like that. There was value in understanding the process. The problem was the processes were not linear because of all the decisions in there, because of the scope of what we were trying to express with our process diagrams. I remember printing out something that on 9 pages of A4 and sellotaping it together and putting it on the wall, to understand all these different flows. When you limit the output to something very specific which you've illustrated, you have a linear process. And then you can stand around that process, discuss it, see if you understand it, and then say, okay, let's go build this. Which is a brilliant way of getting from this, all of the asteroid field now down to something very, very concrete. And you're not going to stop there, of course, but this is going to catapult you towards getting something working and getting your eyes on it. And we know that we learn from doing and we learn from gluing these bits together. So that's the process step. Scenarios. So this is given when then hell. I don't know how many of you have experienced this. I've got a background in quality engineering and testing. And one of the things with thinking about scenarios is we used to do these things called scenario bash. And there's so many what ifs. If you think about the making a cup of tea example, what if there's no tea bags? What if the kettle explodes? What if the water's off? It's just, and it becomes completely overwhelming. The work that I do with teams, certainly a few years ago, I see them just writing given when then stuff in Cucumber, just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of completely unconsumable tests with loads of duplication, no kind of focus. What OOPSI does, if you've approached it, outcomes, outputs, process, by the time you get to the scenarios and you're only looking at this lens for this output, for this process, what you find is that the scenarios are anchored to the process steps, which isn't a surprise if you've ever done use case modelling. It's not a surprise at all. And actually, when you're examining the process in the scenarios, if you find a scenario that doesn't have a home, that you can't map it to a process step, you've missed one. And so it's actually collaborating around these things informs the design in that moment, particularly if you know exactly, if you've illustrated the output that you're trying to create. So what OOPSI does is it gives you a framework for these other practices and other automation tools and other testing approaches that helps you hang your test framework around, which acts as living documentation without being overwhelmed, and it makes it easier to navigate. Are you with me so far? Yeah, good. And then inputs. So when I talk about inputs, if this is the test data, it's not just the inputs, it's the preconditions as well. It's the arrangement of data that you need to construct for a certain scenario to be true. And you know, I spent years as a tester and a test manager reviewing 800-page functional specifications and writing test conditions. And the point at which I wrote the test condition was the first time that real data had ever been considered in terms of executing that behaviour. And so, of course, a load of anomalies immediately would rise up and would then be spinning for weeks and weeks and weeks as we figured out how to get it to work. And so in my experience, a lot of misunderstanding and rework came from not actually testing the system with real data that had been thought through. So you can imagine if you've built your, if you've come into this payroll output situation using OOPSI, and you know the exact steps to generate this very specific output which you've illustrated, this part becomes quite easy because you know the data, you've already collaborated around it, you've already thought about what that needs to look like. And the time of BDD, so can you see what's in here? Can you see anything in there? Anybody see? This is Liz Keogh, who I don't know if any of you know her, but she was very involved in the BDD space 5 or 6 years ago. And she's done a lot of writing. I encourage you to look up her stuff. She talks about deliberate discovery, and it's very much about using examples with real data to discuss the implementation in advance and gain shared understanding. And she says, you know, this lovely little sonnet, we loaded up our caravans and wagons with good advice, best practices and tools, but didn't spot the legend, here be dragons, so we got burnt again. And this is exactly, you know, quite often I remember when, so I'm a fan of all practices that bring this testing with real data forward, because I've experienced that pain. And a lot of time I get, you know, but isn't that a lot of work? And you think, well, hang on, someone's got to do the thinking, right? Someone's got to deal with this complexity. Why not do it before we make the mistake? Okay, so this is the kind of quick run through of OOPSI. Any questions? Because I'm going to dive into an example now and drink some Diet Coke. Any questions?
If I could ask maybe a silly question, what is the main difference between an outcome and an output?
Okay.
The example that you gave me, I was thinking, is in being able to make a payment, like an outcome.
Yeah. So that's actually really interesting, because one of the things with user stories, one of the things that propelled me to do this, is that it's not clear. Actually, you could have an output. You could have a user story that says, you know, as an employee, I want to get a pay slip so that I can check my pay. And that is a user story about an output, right? You could also have a user story about a step in the process. So if there was a point there that said run payroll, you might have written a story that said, as a payroll clerk, I need to be able to run payroll. And in fact, one approach to story splitting is to split it down into its steps. So this is exactly the problem that we are in with user stories. It's not clear what level of detail they are. It's not clear whether you're talking about an output or a step or a condition or an acceptance criteria. And you actually don't know when you're working with it how much of that elaboration has happened. So with OOPSI, you can actually get rid of user stories altogether and know whether you're talking about outcomes, outputs, process, scenario, or inputs. You don't need user stories. The difference between an outcome and an output is an outcome is about a change. It's about a difference, making something better. I always think of the Daft Punk, harder, better, faster, stronger. There's a change. There's a change that is happening, and that's an outcome. It's an impact. And often, user stories are supposed to deliver that, right? Because it's supposed to include the need, but it often gets missed, and the user story just becomes a container for stuff, and then you're trying to track it, but it's actually not a piece of work. It's a story, and it never gets done. Don't start me off, because I could do a whole separate talk about that. We've gone dark. Oh no, we're back. Are we back?
Yeah, we're back.
Yeah. Any other questions? No? Okay, right. This is now me trying to zoom in. So, I appreciate that. I hate myself for saying, oh, I'm sorry if you can't see this from the back, because it's not a good thing to do. But I'll talk through this, and I'll make sure that you can get the gist from.
It'll be on YouTube as well if anyone wants to go through and freeze frame and zoom in and do whatever.
Yeah. Okay. So in the book, these 5 different kind of big steps of OOPSI are actually broken down into these sort of process patterns, and you don't need them all always. It depends if you're using OOPSI in the large or OOPSI in the small, because if you're using OOPSI in the large, it's an iterative thing. You know, you'll start with your first outcome and navigate towards an example that you can build within a sprint or a couple of sprints, and then you go back up and you get the next one and come back down again and go back up and come back down again. So in the large, you know, you're going through all of these steps, which include things that are more normally thought about as more strategic aspects of software development in terms of planning your releases. It helps with that. In the small, it's more about the moving from the defining the output to the process to the scenario to the inputs. Okay, so in this situation, we're talking about a shopping app. Okay, so they already exist. So many of them, and this is an illustration that I thought would be kind of universally understood, which is this one's in the book. So, if we're talking about a typical shopping app, yeah, imagine we've already thought about the outcome. It might be that you're trying to release one that has an edge over a competing shopping app because you want it to be less friction, or you want it to be more reliable in terms of the things you order. So imagine we've already done the outcome, and we've come to a place where we really understand what we're trying to do. And now we're looking at OOPSI in the large. We're looking at the whole thing. What might the outputs be from a shopping app? Give you a minute. Shopping, yeah, getting your shopping. Basket, yeah, seeing your basket. There's my basket.
Delivery.
Yeah, having the delivery actually happen. Yeah, having your delivery time slot shown to you is an output.
Invoice.
The invoice, the receipt. Yeah.
Offers.
Offers, here's your offer. Yeah.
Data harvesting.
Sorry?
Data harvesting.
Yeah. Yeah, we're using your data. Yeah, so I had the same conversation with myself as this room. And the first thing to do with outputs is to brainstorm them. And of course you do this together with the right folks. So brainstorm them. And at first you wouldn't put them in order, you just like you did. And you can see here I've got, thank you for joining Beer Mart. Beer Mart, that's my subconscious about the pub. Big Mart. Thank you for joining Big Mart. Here's some vouchers. Here are your delivery details. Here are your search results. Here are the product details that you selected. Here's your updated basket. Here's your payment summary. Your order's been placed. Your amended order, we pitch your order, your e-receipt, etc., etc. Yes, the first step is to brainstorm the outputs and order them sequentially. And there's a lot, right? There's a lot of these. You haven't done any kind of further analysis. The next bit is then that we talked about how important outputs are, and now you have the opportunity to prioritize them. So if any of you are familiar with story mapping, you might recognize this language, which I really like. Opening game, mid-game, end game, because it's accessible for a customer, right? We say, no, this is just the opening game. And it might just be for us in our team. We're not going live with an opening game, maybe, just for us in our team to get some feedback from you. And so what we do is so this is a bit like story mapping, but story mapping doesn't use outputs to prioritize. So we're not into the process yet, we're just looking at outputs. So here we're going to say, okay, let's start. We want to be able to tell a story. What's the leanest set of outputs? What's the most important outputs? Yeah? And so we're not going to bother about vouchers to see if we can get this working. So what's the leanest set? And with OOPSI, at each step you're trying to look for the 20% where the value lies. You're trying to leave 80% behind. It doesn't always work like that. So let's have a go at, can we as a group prioritize them against these different horizons? There's no time attached with those horizons. So I like to call these value horizons or value increments. They're bigger than a sprint, right? It's some kind of increment. And so we start with this very basic flow. Then we add some more outputs about being able to, so here in the second horizon, we're actually going to look at product details, because they're not going to exist in the first one. Your e-receipt will happen in there, and then we'll add the other stuff in the end game. And this is a great opportunity when you're discussing these outputs to get that alignment on the scope of what you're actually doing and get any buy-in from stakeholders in terms of, this is how we're going to approach it. So that's the first, my laptop's gone dead again. That's the first output step. The next one, which is the most important part of OOPSI, is to illustrate the outputs for the current increment of value, right? And this is where you're going to take an example. And it might feel like a lot of work, but this actually only took me, half an hour to do in Miro, 40 minutes. And so we'll say, well, let's illustrate, let's take the best example we can to illustrate these outputs at each of these, illustrate each of these outputs in our leanest increment. And at that point, loads of brilliant conversations happen. And you want data analysts and architects in the room, because this is informing your first data model, your leanest data model. And guess what? When you build your data model, you're going to use the exact example that's on here. We don't need to abstract it again to prove we've understood. We can use the exact information that's here. So this illustration here, we have an illustration of the delivery details, and of course we can see what data is going to be required there specifically. So it makes us ask questions about what we're actually doing and make decisions just for this, just to get started. So here we've got a reserved slot, we've got some search results when I type in rosé. When those things are added to the basket, we can see the total. Then we've got this payment summary, all done, enjoy your day, and just over to the right-hand side is the receipt. And of course, that payment summary is a bit longer than standard phone. So now we've got a very, very clear expression of scope for a whole increment of value. And if we've got UX folks and engineers and analysts and testers in the room, you're coming out of that super strongly aligned to what you're doing next. The next stage then is to strategically think about, okay, what does this mean in terms of how we build it? So if you're using sprints, these would be sprint goals. So you're still within that first horizon of value, and now thinking about how would we actually go about that. And often I find teams don't have these conversations, which I think is a real wasted opportunity, because you're figuring out how do we, in the most lean way, get good feedback and navigate our way to something which we can see working. So in this example, I've kind of just arbitrarily broken this down. It's not a real example, I made it up. We're saying the first demo, which could be a sprint, this is agnostic to any methodology, OOPSI, could be a sprint. The checkout is stubbed out, the registration details are pre-populated, amendments are out of scope. We're saying the next milestone for a demo would be being able to browse by product category and adding some search filters, editing the basket, and then we'll add the Visa gateway and the payment stuff in the third sprint. So that's just giving us some stepping stones. Without us getting ahead of ourselves, it's giving us some stepping stones. So then here's the process, and what we realise is that the process is linear at this stage. We've got some, if we want to, it might be a bit of overkill, we can start to talk about what are the demo steps, which could become a regression test script. We've already captured the outputs earlier, and there might be we might call out the constraints that we're talking about in terms of things that we're stubbing out or driving from different directions. So that's the process step. What we then have the opportunity to do is brainstorm scenarios. So we're right down to this. We've got one horizon of value. Within there, we're looking at one specific demo for our first sprint. This is our simple flow. We know exactly what's coming out of the end of it. And we think about, okay, what are the important scenarios that we want to cater for? And normally, when you're looking at those different process steps, there's one or two that feel much more important than the others, because that's where the logic happens, or that's where things are being evaluated. And so in this case, search for product has got quite a lot of richness. And so this is going to depend on what you're doing, what you're changing, which bits of the system you're changing, which bits you feel confident in. The sorts of, it's going to very much depend on what you're doing. But it's another opportunity to focus in and say, where's the important stuff? And so you could just brainstorm scenarios across the whole thing if you wanted, but they'd all have a home in these steps if it was in the pursuit of generating the outputs. They'd all have a home. So these are your kind of high-level scenarios. If you were using given, when, then, this is where the specification by example stuff comes in, and this is quite detailed on here. But you can as a team put together your specification or your implementation details that basically pull in the given, when, then is the execution of the particular thing, the search for product, and then the different scenarios. Basic search, category search, partial match, spelling error. These are now supported by the actual input data. Here we've got variations of rose and rows and special characters, and the configuration of the product catalogue. And so if you're very specific about that, not very many examples, it's a very small product catalogue that you need for your first iteration, because you only care about that particular output. Those become functional unit tests, and away you go. And then you just up again round the loop and repeat. What this then allows you to do is these tables become your living documentation, sitting under the search page, which you could see how you could nest that to the higher level so that you can navigate to find out where your living documentation lives. And the thing with specification by example and techniques which essentially use the test data to describe and define the behaviour, you don't really need any words because it's absolutely clear what needs doing. So if you're working on things that have got a lot of where there's a lot of logic, this is extremely useful in terms of getting started. It's not only defining what you're doing, it's defining what you're not doing, which is where you get the acceleration, because you can say, yeah, we're not doing that yet. These are the examples that are in scope at the moment. That is the whiz through of the example. I'm just going to finish with some of the kind of key principles of OOPSI. So the underlying principles, these are the ones in the book. I'll very quickly talk through them. So it's all about collaboration. It could work as a complete delivery methodology by just using those different steps of OOPSI as times to collaborate. Yeah, so at each of those layers you get together, you discuss, you define, you then get going. And so it's a way of, when I was around when Agile first came in, so I'm thinking 2003 or something, I did my first Scrum Master training. And it was all go collaborate, right? But there was no guidance on how to actually do that. You know, what do you mean? How do I properly co-create so that the testers aren't sat there twiddling their thumbs? And so this is kind of where I was trying to join those things up. So it's collaboration is a key principle. Start small. So we're focusing on the leanest, most valuable slice of work. So we know we should start small, right? We know we should do that, but it's hard to actually, in practice, it's hard to do. Hunt the value. So we're kind of tenaciously pursuing this 20% of value at each of those steps. If we're not doing that and we're working in any kind of cross-functional team, we're spending a lot of money and not getting stuff done because we don't know where the value is, right? We might be working really efficiently on stuff that nobody needs. Optimize for feedback and learning. So this is a huge principle behind OOPSI. It's about really optimizing everything that you're doing so that you can begin the learning process as early as possible and keep learning. Use examples to guide the conversation. So the illustrate outputs is an example, an illustration with real data. This is where you hunt the dragons. And then, was that the last one? Oh, optimize people hunt. Yes, those are all of them. Yeah. So if you're I'm not an expert in AI at all, but I've had a lot of feedback from some of the clients that I'm working with on case studies that because of the nature of OOPSI, because it maximizes human interaction and collaboration and shared understanding, they're telling me that it gives a very, very clear target for AI to work with. So I'm trying to comprehend that, but as a non-developer, I'm finding that a little bit difficult to. So I'm looking for folks to talk to about AI, to put some sections together in a dedicated chapter to see how this could work in an augmented development situation and how it might work. So come talk to me down the pub. But I've also got, if you go to my LinkedIn, you'll see under my profile there's an OOPSI mailing list, and I'm giving out bits of the book and Miro boards and stuff and examples. So come and have a hunt around. Questions?
I just have one. So we went through the example process on the Miro, and I was curious about, traditionally in Agile, or at least what I've been doing, is you have your sprint planning, and that's where you will have a bunch of collaboration, a bunch of talking about the tickets that we're bringing in, pointing, all that stuff. Would you say that that's where you would have these conversations, or before that?
Yeah, so it depends which level you're at, right? So in the book, what I've done is in all of the process pattern steps, the 9, I've said if you're working with sprints, if you're working in this way, if you're working with SAFe, heaven forbid, then this is how it might work. So for example, you might not have, if you're working with Scrum, you might not have a session which looks at horizons of value. This might be something extra. It might be something that you do when a new initiative lands and you're trying to align everybody. The sorts of things that you do every planning session would be illustrate, probably zoning in on the process. So the things that look the most like a typical user story would be the steps in the process where the scenarios hang off. So you can imagine that your search product could be a story that you're tracking, and that the acceptance criteria is where you then go and link to the detailed example. So yeah, it depends is the answer. It depends on how big your starting point is, but it's all in the book, giving you very specific guidance on how to use it. But it's almost like if I was going into an organisation, I'd be saying, how do you collaborate? How does a piece of work flow through your organisation? Where are the opportunities for you to get the different disciplines together? And then we'd basically map this way of working out around those opportunities to collaborate.
It seems that prototyping is a kind of a key element of it. Is that fair to say?
Well, it can be, yeah. There's another section in the book that I've written about applications, and it depends. So do you know Cynefin?
Yes.
Yes. So it depends on which domain you're in. And so if you were in the complex domain, you'd be using OOPSI as a navigation tool to kind of probe and test and get quickly to your best example, your cleanest example, and some hypotheses. If you were working in the complicated, you'll be using OOPSI to do the analysis, to understand the examples and the complexity and get the experts in the room. If it was simple and you'd done it before, you might not need the early steps of OOPSI. You might just be using it as a way to structure your tests. Does that make sense?